December 1944. The Ardennes. Before first light, the forest holds its breath under snow, smoke, and diesel fumes. The roads are hard with frost and broken by tracks. Men stand in foxholes with stiff hands wrapped around rifles gone slick with condensation. Somewhere behind them, engines idle low. Metal lids are lifted in the dark. And from a row of insulated food containers on the back of a truck, steam rises into the freezing air. On a battlefield ruled by artillery, mud, and fuel, that thin column of steam should have meant almost nothing. A little heat, a little stew, a little coffee, one small mercy in a continent of wreckage. But in the war in Western Europe, and especially in the final campaigns against Germany, it meant something much larger than comfort. That steam meant that roads were still open somewhere, that fuel had been allotted, that trucks had moved in the night that quartermasters had counted correctly, that cooks had prepared food on schedule, that containers had been filled and sealed, and that the chain from depot to company kitchen to the front had not broken. It meant that one ordinary infantryman had not been abandoned to hunger and chance. That was the real meaning of American hot meals at the front, and that was why German observers found them so difficult to explain. The mystery was never the food itself. German soldiers knew field kitchens. They knew the value of soup, bread, and hot coffee under fire. The German army had long fed troops through mobile kitchens, and no professional soldier in Europe would have been astonished by the existence of hot food in war. What made the American case unsettling was something else. The frequency with which hot food appeared, the scale behind it, and the system it revealed. The steaming meal can was not evidence of indulgence, it was evidence of organized abundance. By late 1944, that distinction mattered immensely. The U.S. Army had crossed an ocean, landed on hostile shores, fought across France, and then outrun parts of its own supply system in the pursuit to the German frontier. The front had moved faster than planners had hoped, and that created strain everywhere. Official American histories later recorded just how severe that strain became. In the second week of September, 1st Army reported only 1.5 days of rations on hand, and 3rd Army less than one. Operational rations in August and September were consumed at roughly double the rate originally expected. Fuel, too, became a crisis of movement and scale. Yet even in a campaign burdened by shortages, truck wear, broken rail lines, port limitations, and autumn weather, the U.S. system kept trying to do something revealing. It kept trying to bring kitchen-prepared food forward whenever conditions allowed. That phrase matters. In the Army's own logistical history, American subsistence doctrine distinguished between field rations, prepared in unit kitchens, and operational rations meant for tactical emergencies, rapid movement, or moments when kitchens could not function. The official language was plain. Under favorable conditions, kitchen-prepared food could be brought forward to troops actually in combat. That was not an accidental luxury tacked onto war after the important work was done. It was doctrine. It was expectation. It was part of the way the Army intended to sustain men. To understand why that mattered, it helps to begin with the ration system itself, because American food at the front was never just a matter of handing a soldier whatever was available. It was categorized, planned, standardized, manufactured, shipped, and issued through a system that reflected the larger American way of war. The A ration was the ideal field counterpart to garrison food, built around fresh and perishable ingredients. The B ration was the same idea without perishables, using non-perishable and canned components for kitchen preparation. The C ration was an individual packaged ration for tactical situations when cooking was not practical. The K ration was compact, portable, designed for assault and combat operations, where weight and mobility mattered. There were also group rations, including the 10-in-1, designed to feed small units efficiently. None of this was improvised at the company level. It was the product of research, testing, packaging science, industrial production, and a bureaucracy that treated feeding men as a technical military problem. Quartermaster planners were explicit about the demands involved. One historical account of ration development stated that a field ration should provide not less than 4,000 calories, and preferably 4,500, because that was what the average soldier under field conditions was thought to require. It should be divisible into meals. It should be as light as possible without losing food value. It should remain palatable over several days, and it had to be suitable for production in large numbers at reasonable cost. That list is more revealing than it first appears. It shows that the U.S. Army did not think of food merely as bulk tonnage. It thought about calories, transport weight, human appetite, manufacturing, and endurance all at once. In other words, it thought like an industrial military state trying to keep morale and combat power aligned. This is where the steaming food container becomes important again. A hot meal at the front was not simply the end point of cooking. It was the visible end of a gigantic hidden process. Somewhere far behind the line, farms, slaughterhouses, canneries, bakeries, refrigeration plants, packing houses, railways, ports, cargo ships, depots, truck parks, fuel dumps, and quartermaster offices had already done their work. The insulated container, with its trapped heat and clanging lid, was a small traveling monument to that entire apparatus. Men at the front did not see the whole machine. They saw the steam. But the steam was enough. For German soldiers and officers looking across the battlefield, or for those who overran American positions and supply points during moments of local success, that was the disturbing part. They were not shocked because Americans had soup. They were disturbed because the soup implied structure. It implied surplus. It implied enough trucks not only to move ammunition and fuel, but also to move prepared food. It implied an army still allocating transport space and fuel to morale. It implied the confidence to believe that a soldier's hot meal was not an extravagance, but part of his fighting efficiency. That is a crucial distinction, because it separates sentiment from military logic. Hot food mattered emotionally, but it also mattered materially. A man who eats warm food in freezing weather conserves heat. A man who receives regular meals maintains strength, mood, and routine. A unit that can expect some rhythm of feeding is easier to control, easier to steady, and less likely to come apart under accumulated fatigue. In every army, hunger corrodes discipline. It narrows a man's world until he thinks only of his own immediate need. By contrast, food delivered on time and delivered hot when possible preserves the idea that someone still governs events. The individual is still connected to the institution. The front is still connected to the rear. War has not dissolved entirely into chaos. The U.S. Army understood this more deeply than the phrase hot chow might suggest. American doctrine treated subsistence as Class 1 supply, an item consumed daily and universally, supplied automatically because it was fundamental to the Army's life. That classification alone tells a story. Food was not peripheral. It was built into the structure of planning. And planning mattered because the American Army in Europe was not small, local, or self-sustaining. It was a mass force operating across great distances, entirely dependent on a logistical network stretched from North America to Britain to the continent and then forward through ports, depots, transfer points, truck routes, and divisional supply channels. The complexity of that chain was staggering. One official logistical history noted that delivering a balanced B ration required careful handling of approximately 110 separate components along the supply line from New York to the using unit. That is a remarkable figure. It means that what appeared at the front as one hot meal was in fact the successful marriage of over 100 moving parts: meat, canned goods, coffee, sugar, flour, salt, fats, dried ingredients, packaging, utensils, fuel for cooking, vehicles for transport, and beyond those, the invisible supports, paperwork, schedules, spare parts, maintenance, labor, and command attention. The hot meal was not simply food. It was the temporary triumph of coordination over entropy. And coordination was not easy in Northwest Europe. The campaign after Normandy was not a neat progression from beachhead to victory. It was a race and then a struggle. The rapid advance across France in the summer of 1944 lengthened the supply line faster than ports and railways could fully support it. The famous truck routes that carried critical supplies forward did heroic work. But heroic work is often what systems do when they are under abnormal pressure. Fuel and rations went forward under conditions that were often unstable and improvised. Captured supplies were used to stave off depletion. Cold storage was limited. Refrigerated transport was insufficient. Fresh foods were harder to sustain than canned ones. The attempt to move from non-perishable rations toward A rations with meat, dairy products, fresh vegetables, and fruit required not only desire, but infrastructure. This is another reason the German reaction matters. When German troops confronted the American front, they were not meeting an army that had found feeding easy. They were meeting an army that was feeding itself under very difficult circumstances and still treating decent food as a combat requirement. That was the deeper shock. The Americans were not handing out hot meals because the war in Europe was gentle or because transport was abundant in every hour and every place. They were doing it because their whole war effort, despite periodic strain and failure, was constructed to push enormous resources forward and to restore normality after disruption with unusual speed. We should be careful here. American soldiers did not dine luxuriously at the front, and there were many moments when they lived on C&K rations because that was all the battlefield allowed. In hedgerow fighting, in rapid pursuit, in forest fighting, in snowbound positions, in the Hurtgen, in the Ardennes, in remote outposts and exposed road nets, hot meals could not always be delivered. Men opened cans with numb fingers. Coffee froze. Bread went stale. Kitchens fell behind. Fuel shortages disrupted everything. No serious account of the war should pretend otherwise. The point is not that the Americans always fed everyone hot meals. The point is that they possessed a system designed to resume that standard as soon as circumstances permitted, and to do so on a scale that few armies could match. That scale was rooted in American industrial capacity, but industry alone does not explain it. Machines and factories are inert unless organization translates them into field effect. Quartermaster work did exactly that. The same institution responsible for food was also implicated in clothing, equipment, petroleum, and general supplies. Fuel and food belonged to the same logic of sustainment. The truck that carried food forward needed fuel that had itself been transported, stored, and rationed. The insulated food container on a cold morning depended just as much on petroleum policy as on cooking. American official histories of the campaign made this connection unmistakable. A modern army, one forward declared, without food will not long survive. In the same breath, it tied food to gasoline and ammunition. That was the American understanding of logistics. Not a pile of separate necessities, but one interlocking organism. German officers understood that organism in principle. They had built sophisticated campaigns around operational movement, supply priorities, and concentrated force. But by the later war, they were working within a shrinking system. Fuel scarcity, rail disruption, loss of air superiority, exhausted transport, and mounting industrial damage narrowed the gap between what was required and what could actually be delivered. Germany still had field kitchens. German troops still received hot food in many situations. The old caricature that only Americans ate well, while Germans never did is false and should be discarded. German armies had long valued hot meals and often depended on them. The famous field kitchen, the Gulaschkanone, was a familiar instrument of military life. But a field kitchen is not the same thing as a field feeding system with deep reserves, motorized lift, fuel access, standardized packaging, and oceanic industrial backing. That was the real divergence. The American advantage lay not in the abstract idea of feeding troops hot food, but in the consistency with which it could attempt it, the redundancy that supported it, and the sheer national capacity behind the effort. A German unit might be fed hot food efficiently under stable conditions, but the broader German war economy by late 1944 was under severe pressure from shortages and attrition. American failures tended to occur within abundance under strain. German failures increasingly occurred within scarcity as a condition of war. That distinction shaped morale in ways statistics alone cannot fully capture. Morale is often spoken of as if it were an invisible quality spirit, grit, confidence, fear. But morale is built from tangible things: dry socks, working mail service, replacement parts, time to sleep, reliable artillery support, and food, especially food. Food is one of the few military provisions that touches every soldier, every day, in a direct bodily way. Ammunition is decisive, but the rifleman may not think about ammunition every minute. He is not firing. Food is different. Hunger is constant, intimate, and humiliating. It lowers a man's thoughts. It weakens judgment. It turns cold into torment. The reverse is also true. Warm food in the cold restores not just calories, but orientation. It reminds a soldier that his suffering has not become anonymous. This is why the rising steam from an insulated meal could mean so much. On an American front, that steam told the rifleman that someone had remembered his breakfast before dawn or his supper after dark. Somewhere behind the guns, someone had apportioned fuel not only for tanks and trucks, but for stoves. Someone had thought through containers, timing, routes, and portions. Someone had believed that even now, amid mud and shell fire, a man should still receive a hot meal if possible. The emotional force of that is easy to underestimate because it looks so ordinary. But war destroys ordinary things first. To preserve one ordinary thing, warm food, at the expected hour, is to preserve a piece of civilization inside organized violence. German observers could see the military meaning of that preservation. They could read it as a symptom of depth. Armies reveal themselves in small objects. A spare part tells one story. A pair of insulated boots tells another. A field telephone line, a full fuel can, a regular cigarette issue, a loaf of bread still fresh enough to slice each is a clue. A steaming food container was one of the clearest clues of all. It suggested that the American army possessed enough transport and enough command attention to keep men fed beyond bare survival. It suggested that this enemy was not only armed, but sustained. And sustainment changes the character of combat. An exhausted army may still fight hard. A hungry army may still resist fiercely. But the army that can recover fastest between shocks usually holds an advantage that is hard to see in a battle map. American firepower has been studied for decades. So has American mechanization. Yet neither exists in isolation from the simpler fact that American soldiers, more often than many of their enemies, could expect the system behind them to keep functioning in recognizable, practical ways. That expectation did not eliminate fear or hardship. It did something more useful. It reduced uncertainty. It told the soldier that he was part of a machine that intended to outlast the crisis. This was especially important in winter fighting. Cold weather multiplies every logistical failure. Fuel is harder to manage. Roads worsen. Mechanical wear increases. Men burn more energy simply staying alive. Hunger becomes more dangerous because the body has less margin. Under those conditions, the difference between cold rations and hot food is not cosmetic. It touches survival, alertness, and morale all at once. And the American Army, which expected field conditions to require roughly 4,000 to 4,500 calories for the average soldier, was operating from a premise that many armies in Europe could not always meet consistently by late war. The intention to feed at that level, and to feed in ways men would actually eat, was itself a form of strategic seriousness. Palatability is an important word here. Quartermaster planners insisted that field rations had to remain palatable over several days. That may sound almost domestic beside the language of campaigns and divisions, but it reveals a great deal about American assumptions. Food that men dislike is food wasted. Food wasted is energy lost. Energy lost becomes reduced performance, weakened morale, and avoidable medical problems. So the American system invested not only in calories, but in acceptability. That is not softness. It is efficiency. It recognizes that human beings are not furnaces into which one can dump indifferent fuel. They are tired, frightened men, expected to march, shoot, dig, carry, endure, and continue. When Americans could not provide hot food, they fell back on operational rations. And even there, the system showed the marks of planning. The C ration, the K ration, the D ration, the small group rations all were attempts to solve particular battlefield problems through design and mass production. The emergency ration was not the whole answer. It was the bridge between normal feeding and impossible circumstances. But bridges matter because they preserve continuity. The American Army did not choose between abundance and austerity as static conditions. It built layers: ideal feeding, substitute feeding, emergency feeding. The existence of those layers made recovery possible. A unit could live on packaged rations during movement or disruption and then return to hot food when the system caught up. That elasticity was one of the hidden sources of American endurance. There is a temptation to describe this as the triumph of wealth alone. Wealth mattered, undeniably. The United States brought immense agricultural and industrial capacity into the war, but wealth without organization produces waste, not power. The American military converted national abundance into combat effect through institutions that counted, packed, shipped, scheduled, repaired, and adapted. One official history of the quartermaster effort described exactly this kind of challenge in another theater, noting that procurement meant more than calculating needs and filling requisitions, the nation's industrial manufacturing. And agricultural capacity had to be brought up to speed. That is the larger story visible inside the smaller one. The hot meal at the front was the frontline expression of a society that had mobilized farms, factories, laboratories, warehouses, and transport networks into a single war-making structure. And that is why German attempts to explain American frontline feeding often ran into something larger than envy. It was not a matter of saying the Americans were soft, pampered, or spoiled. Professional soldiers could dismiss luxuries. What disturbed them was capability. If an enemy can send hot meals forward with regularity, then that enemy is solving problems at scale. He is not merely rich. He is organized. He is not merely comfortable. He is disciplined in administration. He is not merely feeding soldiers. He is sustaining the confidence of those soldiers that tomorrow's battle will also be supplied. And that confidence has strategic value. Soldiers who trust the rear fight differently from soldiers who do not. They still fear death. They still suffer. But they are less likely to feel severed from the institution. They are less likely to interpret every hardship as abandonment. In a long war, that distinction becomes profound. The man who believes the system still cares for him endures strain with a different psychology from the man who feels consumed by an indifferent machine. A hot meal cannot cancel terror, grief, or fatigue. It can do something narrower, and in war that is often more important. It can keep despair from hardening into resignation. This is where the symbolic power of the food container reaches its fullest meaning. Imagine it again, dented metal, heavy with stew or coffee, carried from truck to foxhole line, opened by gloved or shaking hands while winter light comes up over black trees. To a civilian eye, it might look humble, almost trivial. But in the military logic of 1944, it was proof that the republic behind the line was still functioning. Wheat had been harvested, meat had been processed, fuel had been refined, rail cars had rolled, ships had crossed, port laborers had unloaded, quartermasters had issued, cooks had stirred, drivers had risked roads, officers had made room and crowded priorities for something as ordinary as breakfast. That is not sentimentality. That is state capacity made visible. It also helps explain why American war-making looked different from the coercive systems it was fighting. Every major power in the Second World War used bureaucracy, rationing, propaganda, and industrial organization. No state in that war was untouched by compulsion, but democracies and dictatorships tended to reveal their priorities differently in the daily life of the soldier. The American system, for all its waste and occasional blundering, repeatedly tried to persuade the individual soldier that he mattered to the machinery behind him, not as a moral abstraction, but as a practical obligation. Feed him, clothe him, fuel the truck that reaches him, send the container forward still warm. That was not humanitarianism replacing war. It was one way America made war effective. There is a severe kind of mercy in that, not softness, not romance. Just the recognition that industrial war devours the individual unless a counter-system protects him enough to keep him useful and sane. The American answer to that problem was never perfect. Men still froze. Men still went hungry. Units still spent days on cold rations. Mistakes multiplied in mud. The quartermaster forms the fuel allocations. The cooks working before dawn. But you can see the steam. You can see the final sign that all those unseen motions have converged on one hungry man. In that sense, the hottest thing in the American meal was not the stew. It was the message carried with it. You have not been forgotten. The system still reaches you. The war has not broken the chain. Somewhere behind the guns, order still exists. That may be the most important military meaning of frontline food in the Second World War. Not that one army ate while another starved. Not that one nation loved comfort and another did not. Those are shallow readings. The deeper truth is that food exposed how armies were built. It revealed whose logistics could absorb strain, whose industry could sustain standards, whose command culture treated morale as part of combat effectiveness rather than an indulgence, and whose state could still make promises to the individual soldier and keep them. The Americans did not win in Europe because they served hot meals. But the fact that they could so often serve them and keep trying even when the system was stretched told the enemy something grimly important. It said this war machine was broad enough to care about the last mile. It said abundance had been organized. It said morale had been built into supply. It said the American way of war was not only destructive, but sustaining. And that is why the Germans could not fully explain it, because what they were seeing in that steaming meal container was not merely food. It was a whole civilization at work behind the front, industrial, methodical, well-fueled, imperfect but resilient, determined to keep one infantryman warm enough, fed enough, and steady enough to fight another day. In the end, that was the true shock. Not the meal itself, but the immense hidden system that made the meal possible. On the cold main telling, even after setbacks, the aim was to restore function, restore regularity, restore the meal cycle, restore the belief that the line had not snapped. By contrast, once armies begin to treat human exhaustion as normal and replacement of men as easier than support of men, their morale erodes in quieter ways. They may still coerce obedience. They may still achieve moments of ferocity, but they lose the invisible compact between front and rear. In that sense, logistics is never just the movement of things. It is the administration of trust. Food is one of the clearest forms that trust can take. So when German soldiers encountered the evidence of American feeding systems, hot food brought forward when conditions allowed, balanced rations assembled from long supply chains, coffee and stew delivered through mud and shell fire, the stubborn reappearance of routine amid chaos, they were seeing more than a better mess service. They were seeing a clue to why the American war effort was so hard to exhaust. The United States was not fighting as a power scraping the bottom of its reserves. It was fighting as a power that had built reserve into the system, redundancy, depth, substitution, repair, recovery. The hot meal was one small expression of that deeper habit. This is why the image of steam matters so much. Steam disappears almost at once. It rises, curls, and vanishes into winter air. Yet for a brief moment, it makes the invisible visible. You cannot see the farm in Iowa, the packing plant in Chicago, the ship in the Atlantic, the depot in England, the rail yard in France, the truck company on a dark road, fields of Europe, under shell bursts and winter cloud. The rising steam from an American food container became something close to a historical verdict. It showed the difference between scarcity and depth, between exhaustion and replenishment, between an army merely surviving and an army being sustained. It showed logistics not as a technical background to battle, but as ideology made visible. Abundance against shortage, morale against attrition, a state that still functioned for the ordinary man against systems that increasingly consumed him. And so that small moment in the dark, a lid lifted, a ladle dipped, steam rising over frozen ground, was never small at all. It was one of the quiet signs of how the war would end.